Last session of the day. I hope you guys learned a lot of new things in the different tracks. And so right now we are going to meet with members from each of the tracks who are going to give a brief summary of what each session discussed, and then we'll have opportunity for Q&A. We have Dr. Miriam Calkins online via Zoom, who will be talking a little bit about the instructors panel. And then up here we have Jeff Pauley for fire investigators, and Gibson and Golden and Richard Kessler. And so whoever would like to start.
Ladies first.
Okay, thanks for having us again. So in our session, which was titled Structural Firefighting, Career and Volunteers, we had an excellent presentation from Chief Sam Eaton and Gina from the Alliance on decon procedures, contaminant reduction in the field. Followed that from the virtual audience on the practicalities of it, as well as removal of PFAS from that kind of gross decon and whether that was possible or not, dry versus wet decon. So practical questions that some of the research has addressed, but there's a lot more to be done in terms of evaluating the efficacy of certain types of wipes and things of that nature. And then we had another excellent presentation from Ed Mann from FRCE. Very practical, like someone with a wealth of experience looking at the good, the best, and the good, better, best. Sorry, Ed. Focusing on the good when you can't do the best, and practical solutions, particularly in volunteer companies or smaller companies without the large budgets to implement the perfect recommendations in terms of PPE and decon post-fire. Very practical, very entertaining, both of those sessions. And then the epidemiology gets a little less entertaining, but we had a really warm reception for our first of its kind study of an all-volunteer firefighter cohort looking at cancer risk over the past several decades using the same methodology that has been used in all the career studies to date. In the state of New York, we have a cohort of about 15,000 volunteer firefighters that we've looked at their cancer experience. So that's what we were up to, and it was a great group, good questions, and we appreciate the opportunity to present.
Great, thank you. And Jeff?
Sure, absolutely. So we had the fire investigator group. We are, and I mean this with all love and affection, the redheaded stepchildren of the fire service. There are less of us. Unfortunately, however, we are at fire scenes longer, more often, and less well protected than pretty much any structural firefighter. There are exceptions, thankfully, but we have a long ways to go. And one of the misconceptions that we have to overcome is the belief by many, the misguided belief, that a cold fire scene, which we at IAAI define as more than 72 hours without any measurable traces of gases. Of course, we know the particulates persist, but anyhow, we draw a line in the sand at 72 hours, but so many fire investigators think that a cold scene is a safe scene, and it just is not, and becomes our overarching educational goal. So we talked today about the hazards of the post-fire scene. We talked about the best practices that we at IAAI have put together for all fire investigators. It is a peer-reviewed and technically reviewed document. We have a panel of experts. Dr. Burgess is included, Dr. Cabana is included, Dr. Calkins is included, and others who review the document. We're in the second edition, probably starting early next year. We will work on the third edition because unlike 921, which is a nice overview document, this is much more of a how-to manual. So the current iteration is 41 pages. I'm guessing that the next iteration will be 60 plus, because when we know better, we need to do better, and we need to get that information out to folks. So then we had two, so there are currently 4 research projects that we're involved in regarding the fire investigation work. And we had extended presentations on 2 of those, the University of Miami wristband project, which is great, and I firmly believe is going to cause us to adjust our current lines in the sand for some time frames, but that's good. That's what research is for. That's why we do this. Unfortunately, in many instances, research money stops when the big red trucks leave. And so I am just tickled pink that we've got 4 different projects going now. North Carolina State University and the NFPA Research Foundation getting ready, or just in the infancy of a multi-year project to look at decon wipes and fire investigator apparel, because we have folks who are going to fire scenes in jeans and a t-shirt and getting back in their vehicle and leaving after they've tromped around in the fire scene for a couple hours. So we're going to look at everything from that all the way up to structural turnout and a number of iterations in between. So that multi-year project getting ready to go. And then our friends at Underwriters Laboratories, at their expense, metered up about a half dozen burns that they did as part of a grant, tested at their expense. We don't have the data yet, but it is almost any day now. So it's going to start to give us a better picture of the gas and particulate persistence in the post-fire environment. So that's, and then we finished up with the practical work that's being done here in the state of Florida as a result of all of this work that we've been doing for the last couple of years.
Great. And Richard?
Sure. So I was in the fire instructor group, fire trainers and instructors. We started off with a presentation by Gavin Horn at ULFSRI. He had recorded his presentation as he's currently continuing that testing on fire instructors and fire training environments and the impact of our different training fuels. So he talked a little bit about differences between simulated smoke environments, pellets and straw fires, and engineered wood product fires, and the impact those have on our biologicals, what gets into the air, what gets on the firefighters, what gets into the systems. And then the difference between students who may go through a couple evolutions through a day versus instructors who may have repeated exposures over days or weeks or even months. Following that, I talked a little bit about our decon preliminary exposure reduction efforts at the Illinois Fire Service Institute. We put together kits similar to the ones that Florida have done and followed, funded by our state fire marshal, and pushed those out to over 500 departments, giving access to about 23,000 firefighters that now have those kits on their apparatus. Following that, Natasha Schaefer-Sold talked about updates with the instructors and trainers from the Firefighter Cancer Cohort Study. The goal of enrolling 50 trainers right now, just over halfway there, but well on the way to enrolling those. Following that, Chief Frank Lieb talked about common sense efforts to improve or reduce exposure in his efforts at FDNY and their academy. The take-home message I got was that take personal accountability, both for yourself and those around you, and pass that accountability on to those around you. And the best way to make significant change, start small, start with what is acceptable, and keep pushing and be a champion within your department. Take that back. The more champions we have, the more grassroots that organization comes. As it comes together, the more effective it'll be. So that was our instructors and trainers track.
Awesome. And finish off, Ann?
Rather than forget somebody's name or mispronounce it, I'm just going to say in track A, which was Wildland and Wildland Urban Interface, we had a great diversity of speakers and definitely expertise. I noted some constant themes across all presenters, and the main one was that there is no longer a wildland fire season. It is a year. And the workload of the wildland firefighters is something that it really contributes to their ability to sleep well, their fatigue, their cognition, their reaction times, and also their exposure to pollutants. Other themes I noticed were it's still not known exactly what the long-term health consequences of the exposure is. Based on the occupation itself. We talked about the role of the fire coordinator and the administration in terms of aspects such as crew rotation, proximity of the camp to the actual fires themselves, because people are inhaling particulates all the time that they're there, and a 14 days of work, 3 days of rest work cycle is extremely challenging to them. And shift length, I was really surprised to know that that's 13 to 14 hours per day, 14 days straight. And the inability oftentimes to clean your hands and other skin surfaces like prior to eating, and the importance of exposure of the skin itself. There are simple things that can be done to assess different aspects such as sleepiness using simple tools like visual analog scales, heart rate variability, which can be done with accelerometry. Unfortunately, if you lose one of those, you've lost quite a bit of money. And things like urine color can also be used for dehydration. We talked about the importance of awareness and education, and that can be key in cultural shifts that many people mentioned needed to happen. We also talked about challenges with conducting in-field research, and that has to do with recruitment of participants, being able to monitor them while they're performing their duties without interfering in their ability to conduct their job or put them in a hazardous position so that their safety has been compromised. We talked about that using a prescribed burn might be a really good proxy for studying an actual fire environment. A little bit more controlled, and it gives us a little more control as researchers over pre-test guidelines or pre-post kind of conditions. Gosh, how many people mentioned unanticipated unknowns that creep into the whole thing? One of the things I know from my aspect of the presentation was lack of standardized fitness criteria and testing procedures across firefighters in general. And I also found that there's a great interrelatedness between components. Researchers tend to be focused on one aspect or just a couple aspects, but the interrelatedness between all of these is something I think would be really nice to see come together. And lastly, the tools that firefighters in the wild are using to actually help them perform their jobs may actually be harming them, such as the torches used to start the back burns. The PPE itself is preventing heat dissipation. It's extra weight that they're carrying in the field. And so those are what I captured.
That's great, excellent. So it seems like everyone had a lot of information in all four groups. So one of the questions that came up are, what are some practical interventions or strategies for cancer control or prevention that came up during your sessions?
I think it came up in all of our presentations in greatest detail in the actual decon demonstration, which is fairly easy to do. The kit has been widely distributed in many states now and through many initiatives, which is terrific, and all the instructions are available at your website, our website. So that was terrific. But Ed Mann took it to another level and said, if you can't even do that, if you can't even implement that because of weather or other conditions, there's many things that you can do. Do the best that you can, no matter how inexpensively. Do it soon, do it right after the fire, do it practically, use equipment that may not be the ideal, but do something. Don't do the best, do good.
That's great.
And from the Wildland firefighter and the interface aspect, there's no respirator for wildland firefighters. And so they were talking about the need to develop one and get available, which would cut down the particulates, because they use the masks we've been using for COVID.
Right.
I'll add in our session, we discussed some additional methods that the individual could take to reduce exposure, things like changing how we doff our gloves. So at the end of every incident, take off the gloves and immediately touch the outside of that contaminated surface with our clean hands. Whereas with medical gloves and any sort of bloodborne pathogen contaminants, we remove the gloves without touching those contaminants. So can we apply that to our firefighting gloves so that every time we take them off, we're reducing that exposure? Same with our hood. As we take the hood down, put it around our neck, all of that very vascularized region, very thin skin is exposed to those contaminants. Can we modify that and pull the hood up and over the mask and reduce that exposure? So every little step to reduce exposure adds up over time.
Thank you, guys. And so another question that came through for Dr. Calkins and the panel, are there health risks or cancer risks for firefighters with occupational exposures to PFAS from the turnout gear?
I'll start since I was called out. I hope you can hear me. So I'll start since I was called out. I hope you can hear me. And then I'll let others chime in as well. This is a really good question. And I know it's one that is discussed everywhere at the moment. So I'll try to answer it the best I can. But unfortunately, one of the things we are still struggling to understand is that association. There's currently no threshold above which we know the risk of a health outcome from that's associated with PFAS may occur. So with that in mind, it's very difficult to say that above or below a certain serum concentration, you are or are not at risk. We know that certain PFAS are associated with certain cancers, as well as a number of other health outcomes, especially certain systems. There's a number of studies that have looked at immune response, looked at effects in the thyroid. Other hormones have looked at cholesterol and various effects. So is there the possibility that occupational exposure may put you at increased risk for health, including cancer outcomes? Yes, there is a possibility. How much of a risk is there? We don't know. The other part of that question was specifically about PFAS in gear. And I think that's an area that I know we're really tuned into, trying to figure out exactly where that exposure is coming from. The better we understand how somebody's exposed, the more appropriately we can target the interventions to reduce that exposure. We know PFAS is in the gear. We know PFAS is currently in foams. We know PFAS has the possibility of being in structures that are burning. There's a number of different ways in which a firefighter may interact with PFAS through their job. What we don't know is which one of those pathways is contributing the most to that overall exposure. And that makes it really difficult for us to target how we approach that. We don't know how, for example, cleaning the gear may affect the PFAS that is intentionally added to it to give it that waterproofing. We don't know how exposure to heat may impact the PFAS in that gear. So there's a lot that's involved, but the short answer is yes, you are at risk, but we don't know how much or how best to approach it until there are replacements that are available. Anyone else have anything to add?
Great, thank you, Miriam. Does anyone have any questions from the audience before I go back to online? All right, so one other question that came up are, what are some priorities for, or what are two priorities for research that emerged in your respective groups? Two research priorities that came out of your group.
One for the be taken from structural fire research and applied into especially the wildland urban interface would be one of them.
Great.
I think one from ours that's obvious because it's ongoing is the impacts of different training fuels and how that affects firefighters. On the similar note, but a little bit different, is the impacts of repeat exposures to instructors. So as they go through multiple evolutions over a week or months, how do those accumulate in the body and the impact on our health?
So the interesting thing that came up in our discussion via a question, and it has been some tangential discussions that we have had, is around the use of arson detection dogs and how they are contaminated in the scene and oftentimes not deconned and put back into a vehicle, and what are they taking with them? Animal skin is very, non-technical term here, adhesive. I mean, it's going to hold on to the particulates, and you know, it goes back to cold scene is a clean scene, right? No. The handlers often are not properly protected. The dogs are not protected and they're not deconned. So we have a very interesting area there that requires or begs some additional work. Other than that, you know, our research is just getting started. So while we certainly welcome any new ideas, we're doing good right now. But there are other things that, as the current projects come along and progress, I think it's going to open up new areas that we need to look at.
In our workshop, some of the questions about comparative efficacy of, as I said, different types of wipes or washing versus true extraction in terms of the reduction. So the type of work that NIOSH and their collaborators have done to continue to see more fine tuning of that to specific equipment. And then some of the other issues in terms of the epidemiologic research will be addressed in the NFR, basically looking at other occupations, previous occupations or concurrent occupations and the exposures that they may expose firefighters to, as well as the personal lifestyle factors, family history, those types of factors that haven't been adequately addressed as potential confounders of the firefighting exposure.
Absolutely. Okay, and so another question that came through was, for our government stakeholders watching today and here in the room, did your sessions discuss any opportunities to improve policy that can inform health and safety practices?
No, but it's certainly a great area that, I mean, as an industry, the fire service begs for more, in my opinion, more regulations that protect our health and safety. And so any way that can be done. There's no shortage of work here, folks. I mean, there's a lot that we can do, and that's just one of the very important areas.
I think to echo that, one of the key takeaways that I had from our sessions was that a lot of this work is funded through DHS and the Assistance to Firefighter Grants Program. So just thanking, you know, the folks that run that program to keeping that moving, and the importance of that funding in supporting this research is essential for most of the findings we saw.
Great.
Tangential to structural firefighting, the issue of health insurance, kind of shocking to hear some of the stories in terms of retirees' benefits or even active duty firefighters who don't have health monitoring and health insurance adequate to do the early detection and treatment, effective treatment at early stages that we're preaching.
and not knowing exactly what type of policies can be implemented, but focus on physical fitness. And I know it's a challenge while they're in the fire station on shift, but not on call. For, not necessarily the wildland firefighters, but something to reduce the obesogenic environment in which they spend a lot of time, apparently.
Great, thank you. Dr. Calkins, you received another question. So, for how many years does PFAS and other carcinogens stay in the body, and what are the limits before it becomes dangerous for the health?
Yeah, so I can answer
Dangerous for the health.
I can answer the first part of that pretty easily. The second part is going to be tricky, similar to my previous response. So PFOS, I'm not sure if the question was specific to PFOS or all PFAS in general, but PFOS is one of the sulfonates. It's one of the longer chain compounds, often referred to as one of the legacy compounds. And it has a half-life of roughly 4 years. It's a little bit difficult to estimate exactly what it would be for an individual, but the reports are in the range of 4, maybe 4.5 years in the human body. And just so everyone's familiar with the term half-life, that's the amount of time it takes for half of the amount of something in your body to be removed. So the serum concentration would be reduced by half in that amount of time. Other PFAS compounds, PFHXS, which is actually similar to PFOS, but a little bit different, actually it's a little bit shorter, has a longer half-life in the body. It's been reported as high as 8, possibly more years. Some of the other legacy compounds like PFOA have actually shorter half-lives of more on the order of 3 years. And then as we get down in the length of the PFAS, you'll talk about some of the replacements, or the short chain compounds. They, generally speaking, are understood to have a shorter half-life in the body. So they may have a half-life that's less than 3 years, possibly in the order of months. But those studies are really limited, both in the number of people that have been involved and also the duration of them. We're relying on a lot of animal studies for that, and then extrapolating from the animal studies to the human. So I know I said that was a simpler answer. That maybe wasn't as simple as I would have liked it to be. But I hope that answered that part of it. Now, in terms of the level that's safe or not safe, we really don't know. We know there's an association. We know that there may be effects at low concentrations. There are a number of presentations earlier today that talked about epigenetic effects or changes at a genetic level that may put somebody at risk of a disease developing. Whether or not that disease develops is a different question. But I know there's a number of ongoing studies within government and within academia that are looking at this question and trying to figure out that threshold. We just don't know. We don't know what level is safe. I'll add for this question and the previous one that I fielded, that when it comes to that half-life, we don't really know how to speed up the removal of these compounds from the body, although there are some people who are looking into this, blood donation, things like that. But we don't have a great approach to that. And unfortunately, the exposure pathways that we're concerned with, primarily PFAS being the foams and the turnout gear, are things that we don't have good replacements for yet. And those products are used to protect you, the firefighters, on the daily basis from a lot of other known hazards. So there's a really pressing challenge there in finding something that can replace the PFAS in those materials, so that those tools are still as effective at protecting you from all of the other carcinogens that have been discussed over the last day and will continue to be discussed probably tomorrow, and making sure that you're protected from that. But also, we don't want you to be exposed to more, such as the PFAS that are in the gear. So trying to find a balance between those while everyone's doing the research and pushing for the research to get new products that are PFAS free is really critical. So I want to put that caveat out there, that I think it's important to mention that those tools are vital to keep you safe from other things right now. And that doesn't mean that you should be afraid of them, I guess, is what I'm trying to stress, if that makes sense.
Question to PFAS, and I think this was discussed a little bit earlier, but what can be done to eliminate PFAS?
From the body or from?
It seems like yes, from
The body or from?
it seems like yes, from the body.
From the body, I don't know. No one really knows. I know this is being evaluated, and if anyone else has any thoughts on this, please chime in. There's some researchers and some members of the fire service, I believe in Australia, who are working on this as well. I've heard that there's some programs that are helping to eliminate it. I think one of the most effective approaches is just to cut off the source, really. So reduce any continued exposure as much as you can. So that may mean not wearing your turnout gear when you don't have to. So reduce the amount of time that you're spending in your turnout gear. It may mean cleaning and doing good decon of your turnout gear and of your fire station, so that you don't have dust that maybe contains PFAS in that environment that you're living in. It may mean practicing really good hygiene whenever you come in contact with the foams and the products that contain PFAS, all those Class B foams, AFFF, and reducing training with them. I know a lot of states have already stopped, and a lot of we actually we're trying to find fire departments that were still training with it, so that we could capture that opportunity and measure it in the air, and no one's doing it, which is fantastic to hear. All of those types of activities and just cutting off the exposure source is probably the number one thing you can do right now to reduce further exposure and help reduce that level in your body.
And so another question that came in for the group, sleep and fatigue appears to be a cross-cutting theme across all subgroups. What advice or strategies did your groups entertain?
Is there a way to change the 14 days of active 14-hour shifts? Because they're finding that 3 days isn't sufficient amount of rest.
Right.
So better sleep comes with probably less demanding work environment. I would also say improved fitness level can improve sleep patterns. Maybe diet is part of it as well, just from my expertise area.
Yeah, we noted the same things, the lifestyle changes, the diet, the sleep habits, exercise, nutrition all play into the, as we mentioned yesterday, the total worker health.
Yeah, this is interesting because I'm just going to reiterate what I said earlier because it's so important. The cold fire scene is not a safe fire scene. Wear your PPE, please.
All right. So any other questions from the audience? Director Hallis.
Yes. Talking about different levels of, obviously with the structural, there's a lot of bad hydrocarbons and nasty stuff inside most structure fires, even investigation. So much of that is present. And many times you're digging through it. When it gets to the wildland side, and I know this is an area of more future study, so I hope it'll help look at our partners in forestry where they may be in very remote areas, and even though we may have decon kits on their tractors or whatever, a lot of times it's going to be very difficult for them to employ rehab and recovery and cleaning of their turnout gear, or and particularly their wildland gear, and also even their uniforms, and they may be then much closer to their house than they are back to headquarters or whatever. So is that an area that's going to be focused on, is how to do interventions for wildland people in that very rural setting that really don't know? I mean, it seems like we're not being exposed to the exposure to who knows what is built into that forest environment from other environmental impacts that may have occurred, et cetera.
One of the things that was discussed, I think it was more through question and answer, was just carrying extra wipes. Is that an option? You know, is it going to weigh you down too much? But having a way to clean or wipe down the surface of skin or clothing more frequently was one of the things that was discussed, but whatever they carry with them needs to be lightweight. But other than that, I don't recall anything else in that vein.
We discussed some of the practicalities, not as extreme as in the Wildland situation, but wipe what you can, wipe the highly vascular areas, wipe your hands first before you touch anything else. And then also, and the lack of water, dry decon with a dry brush, which isn't very heavy, it adds some weight, but that's better than nothing. And do what you can, do what's practical, even if it's not the ideal.
Okay, anyone else? No. Do you guys want to follow up with anything else? Any final comments? No, all right. Well, thank you guys so much. This was a great panel. I think we got a lot of great conversation from this. And this concludes our day, our second day. I think it's been a really great day. We learned a lot. We'll be back here tomorrow morning for some more exciting presentations. So thank you all for joining us here in person and virtually.